Excellent. So the topic of tonight is not only relevant for right now in terms of how can Jewish law adapt to the reality of a pandemic, but the truth is, right now, being in a pandemic right now with the coronavirus, but a lot of these rulings can apply both to potential future pandemics, which unfortunately that is the reality. There are going to be more. We can be better prepared for them. That's just an important side point. Shouldn't be so side. However, we need to be prepared in terms of Jewish law adapting to what happens when synagogues need to close down. Now, thank God, many synagogues have been able to open safely. Some opened too soon and saw cases. Some opened with every safety precaution and have actually done it beautifully. Some are smaller and haven't been able to do that, but are planning on doing it, God willing, relatively soon. Oh, good, Ken just joined. But again, what we're going to talk about tonight is not only relevant to this holiday coming up this week of Purim, but it's also relevant again to any future pandemic and also anybody who, for any reason, is in a hospital or in a position where they cannot come to synagogue. So the little bit of background, and I didn't want to bring too many sources so we can get right to the meat of it, is that the story of Esther, Megillat Esther, which I'll speak more about on Friday when we actually read the Megillah together as a community. And then there's, of course, the reading the evening before Thursday. But the story, again, is about this incredible miracle and these true heroes, the heroine Esther and the hero Mordecai, saving our people against the evil vizier or prime minister Haman. And the end of the story, Mordecai, with the stamp of the king, with the king's permission, sends out a letter. There's a lot of letters in the book, The Scroll of Esther, saying we should celebrate and memorialize this day. And while that holiday probably started for the Jews of Persia, it spread to become an international holiday for Jews everywhere. So how do we celebrate it? And there's basically four mitzvot. One is giving gifts to the poor. One is sending gifts between friends to actually help people feel closer. One is to have a joyous meal. And a lot of the miracles of Purim actually happen during joyous meals. Esther brought her husband, King Achashverosh, to tell him the truth about Haman at a seudah, at a feast. But the biggest thing, the way that Jews remember holidays, is to read, is to tell the story out loud verbally. So there is a rabbinic commandment, and I'm making a distinction. They're commandments, mitzvot, given by God in the Torah. Don't eat certain kinds of food, keep Shabbat, etc., etc. And then there are certain laws that were enacted by the rabbis, but they were given the authority that was just under the commandments of the Torah. So there's the commandments of God in the Torah, then the commandments, there's 7 that were given by the rabbi, like lighting Shabbat candles and reading the Megillah, the scroll on Purim. And then there's general Jewish law. All of it we're meant to do, but that's where it is. So it's a very, very important commandment that's considered to basically have the authority of the Torah. So either reading the story out loud from a kosher scroll or hearing someone else read it for you. Now, the reality is most people, just don't have a kosher Megillah scroll. It doesn't cost $10. And a kosher scroll can't be something that you just buy on Amazon. Well, you might be able to buy it on Amazon. I don't know if it's kosher, but it's not like a book that you get used at a bookstore. It needs to be a properly written scroll on a certain kind of parchment with a specific kind of ink. There are questions about, certain things, what language it has to be in, but it has to be a kosher scroll. Most people just don't have that. The second thing is a lot of people don't know the proper melody for it. Now, technically, you don't need to read the story of the Megillah with the proper melody. You just need to read it correctly. But most people probably don't know how to read Hebrew. So usually what we do is we have someone come to our synagogues who has a kosher scroll, and they know how to read Hebrew, and they know the melody. Well, it's the pandemic. And as we'll see, for those who it is safe to do so, and that's a possibility, that's certainly the best. Everyone agrees if you can do it safely, of course, do it that way. But that's not the reality for many Jews now, for many Jews earlier in the pandemic, and likely for many people in the future during pandemics, or someone, again, who's in a hospital or isolation for any reason. What do those people do? And the suggestion being made this year is that people can listen in to a recording or a live version of it on Zoom, like we're on right now, or Skype, or over the phone. And the question is, does it count to hear someone read the Megillah over Zoom? Is that the same as hearing it in person? And this gets into huge issues about what is it considered to be hearing somebody? Is there a difference between hearing a live version versus a recorded version? So what we're going to do tonight is look at some of the foundational sources or rabbinic rulings on this issue. And then we're going to look at some major rabbis and organizations and how they have ruled practically. So before we jump into that, are there any questions up until now? You can throw up your hand, and it's okay if you have a question as we go. Excellent. Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And I will say that the first three sources, which are from three very important rabbis in the past 100, 150 years or so, they were all compiled and translated by my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Dov Linzer. He wrote a very important piece that I used to at least get the first sources and a handle on the situation. And the piece that he wrote on doing a Zoom Megillah and what to do has become very important and widespread, not just in the Orthodox movement, but even in the conservative movement. Some of my rabbis who are conservative rabbis are familiar with it. So it's a beautifully written piece. It's very honest and it's very well sourced. So Tamar, if you would take from Igrot Moshe and Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zatzal was one of the greatest rabbis in America in this past generation. And to this day, he's still kind of the de facto rabbi for Orthodox Jews, wondering what is the ruling in a certain case. So on the question of fulfilling certain obligations over the phone, Tamar, go ahead, he writes.
How do we know exactly how hearing works? Perhaps it is also through something created in the air that reaches our ears. This makes sense, given what scientists say that the sound has to travel to get to the ear, and that there is even a brief passage of time until it does so. Nevertheless, it is considered to be the person's voice. Therefore, it is possible that even a voice that is created by the microphone, such that immediately as the person is speaking, people hear him, should be considered to be his voice itself, and this is what makes the most sense. And it is also not clear what scientists mean when they say that the sound that emerges in a different sound. Based on this, it is possible that one should not protest those who wish to read the Megillah over a microphone as a matter of strict law.
Excellent. So there's a few pieces to unpack here. Going back now hundreds of years, not over 1,000 years, we have both Talmudic sources, and ultimately we have a source from Maimonides, from the Rambam. It says, when you hear something that needs to be heard, like the reading of Torah or Megillah or the hearing of shofar, I believe that's actually the main source, this conversation, it says you need to hear the actual sound, not an echo. So what they imagine is if I stick my shofar into a hole and the sound bounces out and goes to your ear, you're not hearing the direct sound waves from the shofar, even though in the Talmud and those sources, they may not have known what sound waves are, but they had a general sense the sound is coming from the shofar. But the sound that's bouncing off a wall or bouncing out of a hole, that's an echo. That's not really hearing it. So what Rab Moshe is doing here is responding to that, is saying that hearing something on Zoom, we're not going to say it's an echo, because when the words come out of my mouth, the thing that's coming out of my mouth, whatever it is, whatever its essence is not going into your ear. Anyone here who has studied physics knows that there is a medium. There's something between my mouth and your ear, air. My voice comes out, I cause the air to vibrate, vibrates all the way to your ear, causes something in your ear to then vibrate and shake, and your brain figures out what the sound is. Nothing is actually going out of my mouth into your ear. So if that's scientifically what's happening, then what's the difference if instead of, let's say someone's in the room right now, I talk, air vibrates, and then it sends, and those vibrations go to the ear. What's the difference between me sending it through the air or sending it right now with all of you through Zoom? What's the difference? Everybody's voice has to go through something to get to your ears. If it's not going to be the air between us, what does it matter if it is telephones. And if you're going to say, well, there's a delay when you have a telephone of whether it's a few seconds or nanoseconds, whatever, well, there's certainly a delay. It's very, very fast. It's a very small delay, but there is a delay between my mouth and your ear. Our brains can't really pick it up. It's so small that when you see my lips move, it sounds like it's instantaneous, but it's not. There is a slight delay. So again, why should a telephone be so much worse? My sound goes through the telephone. There's a little bit of a delay, not a big deal. Now, Rav Moshe recognizes, and Rav Linzer points this out explicitly, Rav Moshe says that people who do that, based on that logic, that my voice going through telephone is not really different than my voice going through the air. The people who rule that you can then hear the Megillah over the phone, they have something to rely on. And it would be inappropriate, unfair, and wrong, according to Rav Moshe, to say that they're breaking Jewish law. But he doesn't love it. And he says, let me go to the Hebrew there. He says, mitzada halacha. Technically speaking, from the way that the halacha, what?
Halachically speaking.
Exactly. Halachically speaking, it technically works. Like, it makes sense. You could argue that. But one of the things that all rabbis have to do when they come out with a ruling is balance technically what's okay, the letter of the law, with the spirit of the law. And Rav Moshe does not forbid it, but it seems like he's not sure that he would want to make that an official ruling that you can, and we'll come back to that at the end, one of the reasons why he won't just say it's kosher and you can do it. Because fundamentally you ask, well, if it works, if hearing over the phone is no different than hearing in the same room, why doesn't it work all the time? But the most he's willing to go is to say that if somebody relies on this, they have an opinion to rely on. But we're not going to say that it's totally 100% permitted and you can do it anytime you want. And again, we'll come back to why that is. And the next source that we'll go to, and then we'll pause, is from the Chazon Ish. And it's interesting. This is actually from a 19th century rabbi, Rabbi Avraham Yeshua Karlitz, known as the Chazon Ish, the Vision of Man. But it's actually quoted in a work by Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was an Israeli rabbi who passed away not too many years ago, in the 2000s or the late 20th century. It was one of the great Israeli rabbis, great rabbis of our time. But Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to unmute you, and you'll see he says something very similar to Rav Moshe, but he's a little bit more hesitant. So Gloria, as soon as you unmute. Did you lose it? If you're having a problem, oh, great.
Yeah.
So Gloria, if you would please read, and again, this is from the Chazon Ish, but quoted in a different work. So please.
It's possible that since the sound is created by the person speaking, and it is also heard immediately, just as how people talk, it is possible that even this would be considered like actually hearing directly from the speaker or the one blowing the shofar. It would seem to me that according to this, we would have to say that the ruling in the Talmud that one does not fulfill the mitzvah of shofar if he heard its echo is because the echo is heard a little after the sound came from the person, which is not the case with a telephone or loudspeaker.
Excellent, thank you. Now, the Chazon Ish is not hundreds of years ago, but he's certainly earlier than Rav Moshe and the next source, another relatively modern Israeli rabbi. So for him, he's not quoting the science of how sound travels through the air by vibrating the air and getting to our ears. He's talking here more experientially. And he's going again to that source in the Talmud that says hearing an echo is not the same as hearing the sound of the shofar or hearing the sound of the Megillah read, et cetera, like that. But for him, his ruling is more based on the idea that why is it not the sound? If you hear me say, how are you? Or you see my lips say, and then 10 seconds later, you hear the how are you, there's a disconnect here. So he's not talking scientifically, he's talking more experientially. And if I'm looking at the reader of the Megillah and I see their lips move as they're reading through the text and I hear it at the exact same time, experientially, it's as if I'm hearing it directly from their mouth, even if it's through another kind of medium. So for him, they had the technology where speakers and telephones he obviously had are all but immediate. And again, anybody who's tried to play a concert with a guitar and sing along on Zoom, there's obviously a bit of a delay. But on Zoom, from all of your experiences, I hope the sound and my mouth are totally lined up. So experientially, it's as if you are immediately hearing what comes from my mouth. Now, Rav Linzer points out that the Chazon Ish is even more hesitant to allow for this. So we can't say that the Chazon Ish says it's totally fine, but he definitely holds by the logic. And in fact, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the rabbi who quotes this, actually rules against ever relying on the telephone for fulfilling anything that you need to hear immediately. And he brings in this source, which he then has to deal with and argue against. But everyone seems to agree it is not so, over the telephone or a speaker or Zoom if they had it, it's not so different. They all leave open the possibility. And then I think you have one of the most explicit permissions. And Leonard, if you'll take source number 3, it's Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, again in the 20th century, living in Israel, and his rulings, particularly on medical ethics, are just incredible and groundbreaking. But here, having, dealing in a hospital with people who just can't get to shul, it's dangerous for them physically, which again, very relevant to this pandemic for many people, not all, but many. He says this, please, Leonard.
And when there is no other option, or in another case, which I was asked about, regarding a large hospital where it was not possible to have the patient hear the Megillah without transmitting it via a microphone, if a pasuk were in such a case to permit it even.
Lechatchila literally means like at first, like a priori, but it's basically like to say that it's totally fine. Not like, oh, it's the end of the world, it's life or death, but like, no, I actually rule this is totally kosher, which no one has said yet. So he's saying if somebody says it's totally fine, lechatchila, then, please, Leonard.
We should not disparage his position.
Excellent, thank you. So what we've seen here, and a little bit less in the Chazon Ish, although again, his logic is that, seeing is believing. It's, seeing and hearing at the same time. That immediacy of it experientially is not so far off. Rav Moshe says scientifically, it's basically like hearing, and the Tzitz Eliezer is not talking about the logic behind it, but he's saying in terms of ruling, it certainly can be okay where there's no other choice. So where the Tzitz Eliezer is really important, and we'll see it come out in the last couple of sources, is him saying that, look, if somebody can go to a shul to hear the Megillah or go outside or something like that, which again, there is a way to do it during the pandemic. It can be done where it's not cold outside and it's safe to do so. Definitely do it that way. But there are places where it won't work. And in that case, there's room to permit it. And he doesn't even say it's totally fine. He says, if somebody, a rabbi, wants to permit it, then we can't say anything against them. And I'll say as a side point, early on in the pandemic, in Israel, there was a question about people who are much older, and it was very dangerous for them to join their families for the Pesach Seder, and they were going to be completely alone. It was just this terrible, tragic, depressing thing that they would have no Sedarim. So the question was, could they turn on a computer and maybe put it on mute, but like leave it on, not touch it, just leave it on there. And there's absolutely halachic basis, even if it's not fully accepted, there's definitely legitimate opinions for just leaving a camera on. They have the Western Wall, they have the coattail cam that shows the coattail 24/7, and everyone says that that's fine. So a number of Sephardic, very Orthodox rabbis said it's okay. A number of Ashkenazi rabbis said it's not okay, but the way they did it wasn't, we disagree and we don't feel it's kosher. That's fine, and you can argue for it. What they said was, these rabbis, they don't even know what they're talking about. They're fools. They don't even know how to decide Jewish law. That's disparaging. And that's unacceptable. It's purely political. It has nothing to do with Jewish law and what is not permitted. And that's what's so important from Rav Moshe and Tzitz Eliezer. They may not like it. They may not even think it's totally kosher, but they respect the fact that others do say it's kosher, and they have something to rely on. And that's been so important during this pandemic, is there are a lot of people who have taken leniencies because we don't have another choice. We really need to rely on those leniencies during this scary time, and any scary time with sick people or another pandemic. And it is totally legitimate for a rabbi to say, I don't think that's kosher. I won't rely upon it, but I respect those who choose it. That's very different than saying those people who are being lenient are destroying Judaism and they're non-Jews and they're monsters. And you bet there are people saying that. And it's so clear from these rabbis that they're uncomfortable with this ruling, but they're so respectful of the fact that there are times when it is needed. And what we'll see on the next page, page and a half, are major rabbis and Jewish organizations respectfully disagreeing with it, but recognizing that sometimes Jewish law needs to be more flexible. So before we go on to the second half of the class and see how people actually rule, any questions up until now? All right, very good. So we'll go on to the next page. And Elizabeth, I will unmute you for that while I get out the next source. And as I said, now we're going to get into some actual rulings. So this first ruling is from Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. He's an Israeli rabbi. He's head of a yeshiva, Har Bracha, and he regularly writes a column in a newspaper that I believe was founded by his father, another rabbi, and it's on relevant halachic topics. So he wrote one something like halacha be corona, the law when it's corona, and he writes specifically on our topic of tonight. So Elizabeth, if you would take source number 1 here, please, from Rabbi Eliezer Melamed from his column in Arutz Sheva.
The sick and isolated men or women who do not know how to read the Megillah themselves, and there is no one who can read it for them, if they're able to read the Megillah from a kosher scroll without errors, even though they do not know how to read with ta'amim, they should read the Megillah with a bracha. If they are not able, they should hear the reading of the Megillah through a loudspeaker from the street or live over the phone, but not on Zoom, for sometimes there are disconnections in its broadcasts, and if one does not hear a single syllable, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Indeed, we usually rule in the opinion of those poskim who hold
those who decide Jewish law.
Who hold that one should not fulfill his obligation by hearing brachot and the reading of the Megillah using electrical devices such as a live broadcast over the telephone or through a loudspeaker. However, with no other choice, one should rely on the opinion of the lenient poskim. See, and then it tells you.
And he's actually referencing his own published work, which is a great book if anybody wants to buy it. It's all online for free, which is great, English and Hebrew. But this is a very important thing that rabbis do when you're actually ruling in the real world. Is there's often gradations. Ideally, we'd be in shul without masks and being able to do everything. That's not ideal. The next case would be to be able to do it again in a public setting where you're hearing it directly and doing it safely, whether it's outside or a large sanctuary, whatever it is, doing it in person. But then he starts going down. So that's the ideal. The next one down, which often people actually rely on, even in a non-pandemic year, they're on vacation, they're in a town without a shul, which is get yourself a kosher scroll. So if there was ever a year to invest in a kosher scroll, this is probably it. And again, you can check Amazon and see what they have, but I wouldn't buy from there. And if somebody can read from the scroll, and this is the thing, when we read from the Torah, from the Megillot, there's a special melody. Now that melody is meant to help us give meaning to the text, like it's a tense moment, a happy moment, but also helps with periods and commas, etc., like that. If one knows that, great. But if they don't know that, as long as they can read the words, and ideally at least the general sentences without mistakes, then it's considered kosher, and that person can even say the blessings. So if somebody is stuck at home and they can get hold of a kosher scroll and they read Hebrew fluently, that in a pandemic is actually probably the ideal thing, other than going to a minyan or a group and hearing it from a professional reader. But again, a lot of people don't have a kosher scroll and they are not able to read the Megillah. And he's very clear here. The Megillah, one only fulfills their obligation if they read it perfectly. So somebody who can kind of read Hebrew sloppily and make a lot of mistakes, we've all heard the person who kind of fumbles through the Hebrew and they get the gist, but they make a lot of mistakes. That will not fly. It doesn't fly for Torah reading, won't fly for Megillah reading. So what do most people do? Can't go to shul and they want to hear the Megillah reading. And he says they can listen to it through another medium. Now he rules against Zoom. I know many other rabbis who say Zoom is fine, but his reason for it is very important. If I'm in shul and I'm hearing the Megillah reading, I need to basically, I have an obligation to read it. I, as a Jew, have an obligation to read the Megillah, but I can rely on someone else reading it out loud for me. But in order for it to count as if I'm reading it, I need to hear it. There's this phrase in Hebrew, shomea ke'oneh, the one who hears is as the one who answers, which means that if I'm listening to it and the person's reading on my behalf, it's as if I'm reading it. But if I'm reading something and then I close my eyes and turn 2 pages and I haven't read 2 pages, it's as if I haven't read it. So too, if I'm in shul and my son comes up to me and says, Daddy, I have to go potty, and I walk out of shul for like 5 minutes and I've missed the text, I'm in trouble. Now, fortunately, I'm able to read and catch up on the text and read it on my own. But what happens if someone's on Zoom and it cuts out in the middle? Now, I'd say most people who've come to the Zoom classes, like 99% of you, never had that problem. There are 1 or 2 people that have consistent issues, and that's a problem. That is a problem. Now, based on the general experience of Zoom and other rabbis who rule it's okay, for our shul, I'm ruling that Zoom is okay, but that's an issue. If somebody gets cut off, and I'll say this when we read together on Friday, if somebody gets cut off in the middle of Zoom, then what they should do is have a text to follow along with and keep reading until they catch up with the actual reader. So that's what he's saying here. There's an ideal progression. Ideally, you do it in shul with a reader. Actually, ideally, you read it yourself, with all the brachot, with the cantillation. Then you hear it from someone else. Then you read it alone in your home, and then you hear it from someone, according to Rav Melamed, over the phone or loudspeaker. And then based on others, I'm ruling that Zoom would be okay. So any questions on Rabbi Melamed's ruling before we go on to the next source? Excellent. So the next source here, and Ken, I'm going to unmute you for this one. This is really important because this is the Orthodox Union. They are one of the biggest, most important organizations in the world, particularly for kashrut, but also for supporting synagogues. Our shul, Lake Park Synagogue, is an OU shul. There's no such thing as an OU rabbi, but they're Orthodox Union shuls. They support shuls. They have a publishing wing. I mean, they make their money from the kosher food, but they do a lot. So their rulings, particularly around coronavirus, which our shul is relying on in terms of when we will open, their rulings on coronavirus are very important, and you will see reflected here. Again, ideally, what one would do, and then even though we don't love it, we recognize that in certain cases, we can be lenient. So Ken, please.
I took a quick look as an aside on Amazon, and I did see supposedly a kosher Megillah for $1,700.
So that might actually be a kosher one at that price point, but I would go to if anybody really wants one, which again, if you can afford it, it's a good thing to have, not just for you to read, which is amazing, but sometimes you'll be in a shul or a situation where someone knows how to read, but they don't have a kosher Megillah scroll. And I've been in that before, where we had a reader for our shul who said, I know how to read, but I don't have a scroll, and we had to find somebody who could lend them a scroll. So if anyone has $1,700 to drop, go for it. But if we don't have that, then Ken, please.
Okay. Orthodox Union guidance regarding coronavirus. Shuls should conduct public davening and Megillah readings only with proper masking and social distancing in accordance with local regulations and guidelines. Generally healthy individuals should attend public Megillah readings as usual, where the community is exercising the proper precautions of social distancing and masking. Those who are not currently ill but are not attending a public reading because they are deemed high risk should reach out to the rabbi in the community to help arrange a private Megillah reading. Those who are ill or have had serious exposure and must remain in isolation must not come to shul. To fulfill the mitzvah, they should have a kosher handwritten Megillah in hand from which they read audibly, either on their own or assisted by a reading heard electronically.
So that point that Ken, you just read is somebody, if they get their hands on a kosher Megillah scroll, they can go to YouTube and have a recording of someone reading slowly and carefully, and they're or MP3, and they read along with it. Now this assumes they can get a kosher scroll, which again, ultimately, if somebody wanted that, it's not impossible to find it. And they would read along with it as best they could, but they also have to be able to actually read the Hebrew letters. Go ahead, Ken. This next source is really important because it really captures all the first sources that we've explored.
The clear majority of halakhic authorities do not consider halakhically adequate a Megillah reading heard over the phone or online. There is, however, a minority opinion that does allow for this, provided that the reading is live and not pre-recorded. Following the halakhic principle that we may rely on a minority opinions under extenuating circumstances when no better option exists, this minority opinion can be relied upon.
Excellent. So not only is this important because this is what our shul is relying on this year for Purim, God willing, not next year, but this is also an incredible insight into Jewish law. And this is often a battle that erupts between certain communities, which is there's more than one opinion on certain matters in Jewish law that are valid. Now, in an ideal situation, we as a people rely on the majority opinion, and we don't rely on the lenient opinion when it is not needed. The question is, how do we define when something is needed? So in the area of life or death, generally everyone agrees you can rely on a lenient opinion. And coronavirus essentially is a life or death thing. And sometimes it's not always, there are safe ways to hear it, but really risking our health is a time, it's a sha'at hadachak, literally a pressed or urgent hour, a time which is an extreme circumstance, and we can rely on a minority opinion. And that's so key, I'll say that again. A minority opinion is a valid opinion. It is not what we follow in most normal cases. It is how I, as a rabbi, I generally follow the majority opinion. That is the way that Orthodox law has developed. However, there are absolute times when it is not only okay, but really almost we must rely on a minority opinion to protect ourselves. And again, there's a big debate. When is a pressing time? Sometimes it's life or death. Sometimes it's a matter of how people are treated in a community, whether it's with women, people of color, people with different sexual orientations. And there's a lenient opinion that will allow them to have greater access or greater roles in the synagogue. And that's a really big debate. Are we in an urgent time where we can rely on the lenient opinion there? So that's, again, a whole class in and of itself, but that's the general principle here. There are valid minority opinions that generally we don't rely on. The question is, when are they activated? And as the OU says, we don't like it, but it is absolutely valid. And when needed, go for it. And that is, again, what our shul and many other shuls are relying on. Yes, Ken, please.
Yeah, so I think one thing I'm coming away from here
Please.
is that what's critical in any circumstance is that the reading is done from a scroll. You can't stay home and say, well, you know, my Zoom is down. You know, I have my book over here. I'll open it and read it, and that'll be kosher.
So in guess again, when you have like your list of going down, ideally you be the person reading it for the shul with brachot and everything like that. But for most people, the ideal situation is hearing it in a minyan from somebody who's reading it from a kosher scroll. The next level down would actually be to read it yourself. I mean, unless someone comes into your home, but to read it yourself from a kosher scroll, at least with the correct words, if not all the proper cantillation. The next level down, which is what we're, so it's really only 3 on the list, is to hear it from a kosher scroll, but remotely. The next one down, and this is the one that, again, it's a question of, does it really fulfill the mitzvah, or is it you do it because it's the best you have? If somebody's really in the middle of nowhere and they don't have a kosher scroll and they don't have a telephone or Zoom or anything like that, what should they do? And then reading from a book might be permitted. We talked about this last Shabbat. Was the Parsha of Zachor. It's the only time there's an obligation of the individual to go to shul. And again, most rabbis are going to say, go to shul or find some way to hear it from someone going around reading it from your window, like Romeo and Juliet, from in front of your house. But there's an opinion in the Shulchan Aruch that if somebody can't hear it from, and again, if you can get your own kosher Torah scroll, read it yourself. But if you can't do that, then you can read it from a printed book. So there is precedent for, again, if you're at the bottom of the list and there's nothing left. So this is what's key. If someone's going to say, well, I can't hear it in shul, I can't read my own, and I can't hear it on Zoom, so I'm just going to skip Purim this year. No, then you would read it from the book. Now, if someone asked me, then Rabbi, do I read it with the blessings? Then I would say no, because there is a debate of rabbis whether it's accepted or not. For example, we are going to have somebody reading it from a kosher scroll. However, because it's through Zoom and whenever there's a debate about rabbinic law and has to do with a blessing and there's two opinions, we don't say a blessing because it's not a Torah command. We're lenient when it comes to blessings. If everyone agreed that it's totally kosher over Zoom, we would say a blessing. Now that doesn't mean that our community is not fulfilling the mitzvah. It just means that when it comes to the blessing, it's better to not say the blessing because reading the Megillah is a very high level mitzvah. Saying a blessing is enacted by the rabbis. So you can be more lenient on things just by the rabbi's regular Jewish law, but things that are a high level mitzvah, do it as best as you can. So again, if somebody, yeah, go ahead, Ken.
But the Torah, the person who is reading the Megillah from the scroll in the synagogue or wherever, they will say a blessing, no?
If they're fulfilling it for themselves. So that's an interesting question. Would I have the person say it? I have to ask that person if they're comfortable doing that. But for example, there's a one of the brachot is about at the end is only done when there's a minyan. So there's, God willing, going to be at least a dozen, 20, 30 of us listening to the Megillah. We won't actually be there in that place. So there, I would definitely rule that the bracha is not said. So again, it's an interesting question. Would they, if they've already fulfilled their obligation, would they say the blessing again for us when there's a rabbinic debate about whether it works at all? So again, we're going to rely that it does fulfill our obligation, but when it comes to blessings, it's generally better to not say a blessing when you're not sure. That's the kind of rule of thumb. If you're eating something and you're like, I think I said the blessing, I'm not sure, don't say the blessing. Unless it's a commandment from the Torah, like shaking lulav or something like that. Or actually, no, you wouldn't say the blessing because that's rabbinically enacted, but you would, if you weren't sure if you shook the lulav, you would definitely shake it again, but you wouldn't say another blessing. So this last source here is really, really important. So Rav Hershel Schachter is one of the head rabbis at Yeshiva University, and he's probably one of, if not the leading rabbi of modern Orthodox Judaism and really just Orthodox Judaism in America. And he is on pretty much any issue, any halachic issue of the day in America. If you have an article that's listing what rabbis are saying, he's going to be on pretty much every article on every single list. Not that he's necessarily going to be the final word, but he is always a part of the conversation. And he is humble and brilliant. So he's very important. And there was an interview very recently in a magazine called Jewish Action. And in it, he was asked not only about the ruling, but specifically, well, this year, we're ruling that it's okay to hear on Zoom. What about next year when there's not a pandemic? And again, we're not talking about somebody who has a chronic disease and they're in isolation in the hospital. It has nothing to do with the pandemic and it's not safe for them to go to shul. We're not talking about them hearing the Megillah on Zoom. We're talking about the person who says, look, we had Megillah on Zoom this year, Rabbi. You ruled it was okay in 2021 or 2021. Why can't you rule it's okay this year? I don't want to go to shul. I'll just listen to it on Zoom. And the rabbi who says, no, we did it that year. We're not doing it again. How do we find that balance? So he's asked about that question. So I will go ahead and take this last source. So the interviewer is a Rabbi Shul Robinson. And just a little insight, the language here is in the yeshivish, very Orthodox world, no one will speak to the rabbi directly. And I do not want anyone to do this to me, not that anyone would. When you say, oh, how are you doing, Rabbi Dinan? In the yeshivish world, they would say, how is the rabbi doing? Always referring to them with the third person. So that's how just to explain what's going on here grammatically. So is Rav Schachter concerned that some of the very novel rulings issued in these last few months might become the norm in certain communities even after the current crisis is over? For example, what if people want to hold Megillat Esther readings via Zoom on Purim every year, or host a Sium Ta'anit Bechorot, which is a learning thing before Pesach, so that firstborns don't have to fast that day, doing that over Zoom? I think we talked about it this last year. I don't remember what we did. I'll have to go look at my emails. Or conducts Mechirat Chametz virtually, selling of Chametz virtually. Isn't there a danger in creating new halachic precedents? Is that something a posek, meaning a decider of Jewish law, has to take into account? The Rav Hershel Schachter responds, there is a danger, but we have no choice. You can't expect someone to go around reading the Megillah for 1,000 people in their homes. B'sha'at hadachak, in an extenuating circumstance, which again, a global pandemic absolutely is, you have to rely on kulot, halachic leniencies. So this Purim, we paskin, meaning we made a halachic decision that one is Yotze Megillah, fulfills the requirement to hear the Megillah via telephone. So if someone said, so Rav Schachter, would we be allowed to rely on that next year? He would say no. But is there a concern that some communities, some boards say, well, we did it this year, we're going to keep doing it forever so that anybody anywhere can just stay at home in their bed and hear it? That might be a real challenge. And he says, look, that is a challenge. But the flip side is if we didn't rule that way, then nobody would fulfill Megillah this year. And that's much worse than relying on a lenient opinion in the future. Again, you have to balance. We ideally don't rely on leniencies. In the best situation, we don't need to, but it's much better to be lenient than to not allow thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to be able to fulfill a mitzvah. And then he continues, was there a hava amina, initial supposition, meaning this idea ever pop up in your head, to say that we shouldn't do Zoom Megillah readings? And by the way, when Rabbi Melamed said we don't do Zoom, you already get from here that obviously here in America, Zoom is an accepted way to do Megillah readings. To say that we shouldn't do Zoom Megillah readings in order to prevent the ruling from being misapplied in the future, when people might consider it a new viable option. So it's a continuation, previous question. And Rabbi Schachter says, no, I don't think so. B'sha'at dachak, we are mekel. So again, in extenuating circumstances, we rule leniently. That's Jewish law is flexible. It's meant to live and be alive with us. There may be reason to worry that some might use the leniency when it is not sha'at dachak, an extenuating circumstance, but we have no choice. If we want to be yotze and fulfill our obligation of the mitzvah this year, what's the alternative? Tell people not to fulfill Mikra, the reading of Megillah this year? I don't think that's right. And I think he said it beautifully. And again, you can hear that in his voice. He loved that we wouldn't have to do this. But that's just the way the cookie crumbles. And again, Jewish law is very flexible. It needs to be. It is a live adaptive thing. So the rabbis that say, I won't permit it for my community, total respect. But the ones that say no one can rely upon it and everybody who's doing it isn't fulfilling any of them, they are missing the whole point of Jewish law. And even though they're rejecting a leniency, the truth is they're in the minority when it comes to the way that Jewish law works. And Jewish law relies on leniencies and flexibility when it must. And right now, boy howdy, it must. So what I want to do right